Good evening, my dear friends. Welcome to another episode of Outstanding Life Lessons, Outlandish Talmud Stories and Outstanding Life Lessons. This is part 35. Tonight's class is titled A Leader's Tragic Deafness. I want to thank Sherry Esformas for dedicating tonight's class in honor of her children. Thank you very, very much. May God bless you with lots of nachas and joy from them, a beautiful family, and all of God's blessings in a revealed way for you and your family. If you'd like to dedicate a class and help support what we're doing, there's a link in the video description, and we'll be very appreciative of your support. The link to download the source sheet for tonight's class is also in the video description. We have a number of outlandish, incredible sources, so download it and follow along. We are a couple weeks away from Pesach, and already last week we learned an episode from Pesach in history and a passage from the Haggadah. And in essence, tonight's class, although not essentially focused on Pesach, but is also a message, an idea, a teaching about Pesach. You know, the truth is any teaching, any message which lifts you, inspires you, brings some redemption to your life, allows you to get out of the exile that's trapping you down, whether it's an exile from without or from within, and lets you discover more of who you are and who you should be. That's already a Pesach message. So Pesach is a time of redemption, and we're going to learn a story and a teaching, or a number of teachings, that should hopefully bring redemption and a lot of personal development and spiritual enlightenment to your life. The subject of tonight's story is a fascinating rabbi. His name is Rabbi Elazar ben Arach. Rabbi Elazar, the son of Arach. Now, he lived towards the end of the first century, second century. This is the period of time right after the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans. In fact, it's the same period of time as last week's story. Last week we learned about the 5 sages who were having a seder together. Rabbi Elazar ben Arach was not one of them, but there was a Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Akiva, and there were others. Tonight's Rabbi Elazar ben Arach is a colleague or even a teacher of some of them, a teacher of Rabbi Akiva and a colleague of others. So it's a similar time period. And we're going to get to learn about this fascinating sage and learn an outlandish story about him. Here's a bit of background about him that will show you what an awesome sage he was. The story goes that he was once traveling with his Rebbe, his teacher, whose name was Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. We have studied about him before many times. He was the great leader, the transitional leader, towards the end of the times of the First Temple, at the period of destruction, and then incredibly influential in the rebuilding of Jewish life post the destruction of the Temple. He moves the yeshiva, he moves the academy, the Torah learning out of Jerusalem. It's destroyed, but he pleads by the emperor, at least give us Yavna, give us a city where we can rebuild the schools and continue Torah learning. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was the archetypal leader that we've spoken about and that we refer to and we reflect on his life very often. Now, one of his students, he had several great students, we're going to learn about that, but one of his great students was Rabbi Elazar, the son of Arach. And once, the Talmud tells us they were traveling on their way. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was on his horse at the front. Behind him is Rabbi Elazar ben Arach, his student, on his horse. On their way, Rabbi Elazar ben Arach turns to his teacher, Rabbi Yochanan, and he says, Rebbe, I want you to teach me the teachings of what we call Maaseh Merkava. Maaseh Merkava literally means the episode, the teaching, the workings of the chariot. What is this chariot? So you may be familiar, but in the prophet Yecheskel, Ezekiel prophesies about a chariot and a heavenly, cosmic, spiritual chariot. And there are 4 wheels on the chariot, and his 4 wheels have 4 different images: the face of a lion, the face of an eagle, the face of an ox, etc. And in the Kabbalah, in the Jewish mystical teachings, the chariot becomes this unbelievable, very powerful, very deep and esoteric metaphor for perhaps the most profound spiritual teachings of the workings of the cosmos, of peering into the divine, peering in behind the curtain of reality in ways that most people really cannot understand, cannot appreciate, which is why the Talmud says that we don't teach Masei Merkava to anybody. It's not something that we teach online and we teach to the masses, but it's a kind of teaching, it's an esoteric discipline where teacher passes it on to a select student, a student that they feel is capable, that has the spiritual stature to be able to understand, to absorb, and to really internalize it in a beneficial way. We learned a few months ago the story of the 4 rabbis who went into the pardes, into the orchard, and peered behind the veil of reality. And for some of them, that was a very dangerous journey. One of them died, one of them went crazy, one of them became an apostate, if you recall. So we're very careful about these teachings, which is in general, when it comes to Kabbalah, you've heard of the idea, you don't study Kabbalah until you're 40 years old, you don't study Kabbalah until you've mastered all of Talmud and the other legal teachings of the Torah. So this episode of Merkaba, of understanding the divine chariot and the workings of the spiritual cosmos, is very exclusive and elite. And Rabbi Elazar is now asking his teacher, Rabbi Yochanan, I want you to teach it to me. Now, to be clear, Rabbi Elazar knew about it already. He was already taught about it, but he wanted to hear it again. He wanted to hear more. Rabbi Yochanan tells him, Rabbi Elazar, you know already, we don't just teach it, here on the field to anybody at any time. We have to choose a special moment, a special location, very private, where I can convey it to you. So Rabbi Elazar says, you know what? How about I teach you something and I want to get your approval. I want to see if it's correct. Rabbi Yochanan agrees. All of a sudden he stops his horse. He gets off the horse. He puts on a jacket. He puts on a hat. He puts on a garment. He sort of gets dressed up in a very respectful way. Rabbi Elazar asks him, Rebbe, what are you doing? I'm just going to share with you a teaching. So Rabbi Yochanan says, you think I'm going to listen to a teaching about the Merkava just in my regular mundane clothing riding on my horse? I have to be in a mode, in a posture, to be in a respectful way, to be able to listen and absorb, which is a lesson in and of itself, by the way, when it comes to studying and praying. There's a dress code, there's a kind of posture, there's a way that we conduct ourselves very different than how we are in the gym, in the office, or on the street. Rabbi Elazar, the student, starts to share a teaching of the Merkava. As he starts to teach it, apparently the Talmud says fire, whether it's a physical or a spiritual fire, starts to spread around all the trees of the forest around them. And the angels start to sing and the trees start to sing. And they quote the chapter from Psalms, from Tehillim, from King David that says, praise the Lord from the earth, sea monsters in all depths, fruit trees and all cedars, praise the Lord. And sort of the entire physical universe starts to enrapture in this spiritual ecstasy along with the teaching of Rabbi Yochanan. Then an angel, the voice of an angel came out and said, the way you're describing the Merkava, that's exactly how it is. You understand it, you have it right. And the Talmud tells us that Rabbi Yochanan, the teacher, was so impressed by his student, he walks over to Rabbi Elazar, he kisses him on the forehead, and he says, blessed be God, Lord of Israel, who gave our father Abraham a son, a descendant like you, who knows how to understand, investigate, and expound upon the design of the divine chariot. And Rabbi Yochanan said a very famous phrase. He said, there are some who know how to expound beautifully on the Torah's teachings, but don't fulfill its imperatives very well. There are some who are excellent at performing the imperatives, the instructions, the mitzvot of Torah, but aren't very successful or capable of expounding on the Torah's teachings very well. But you, he says, my dear students, have both the skill and the ability to expound on the Torah's teachings beautifully, but also you are excellent in performing the Torah's imperatives as well. So he concludes and he says, Ashrecha, happy are you that our father Abraham has a descendant like you, Elazar, son of Arach. That is just one episode or a teaching to teach you about the greatness of this sage we'll be learning about tonight. The truth is that if we go through the whole Talmud and the Mishnah and those early teachings of rabbinic literature, we don't find Rabbi Elazar, the son of Arach, very commonly. We don't have many teachings from him at all. We have a few We have in Pirkei Avot, chapter 2, Mishnah 14, there's a very famous Mishnah there where Rabbi Elazar taught three things. He taught, always be diligent in the study of Torah, spend every spare moment you have in studying Torah. Then he said, study Torah in a way that you know how to respond to a heretic. Meaning, don't just study Torah that you should understand, but study in a way that if a heretic would come and express doubt and express questions and try to place all kinds of doubtful conspiracies on the truth of the Torah and of God, you have to know how to respond to them as well, be equipped with explanations that can satisfy them. And finally, he teaches, and always remember before who you are toiling and you are working, who is your employer, who will repay you the reward of your labors. Remember that God is in charge. That's a famous teaching of Rabbi Elazar. There are several others, but not many. Why aren't there so many teachings of him? We're actually going to discover in today's outlandish story. So let's go to the source sheet. In the source sheet, you have 5 sources today. The first 3 are interesting because they are different versions of the same story. So the story we'll be learning tonight comes in different versions. The content or the punchline of the story is identical in all of them, but the circumstances behind the story are a little different. And that's important because to understand the story, to take away these outstanding lessons, which we're hopefully going to do, we're going to pay attention to some of these nuances in the different versions of the story. So we're going to begin with source number 1, which is a passage from Talmud in Shabbat, page 147b. You ready? Let's begin. Rabbi Chelbo taught, the wine of Phrygia, Parogaita, and the water of Deafness deprived Israel of the 10 lost tribes. So Parogaita and Deafness are names of 2 cities, 2 locations. They may have been right next to each other or perhaps not. It's assumed they're somewhere in northern Israel. And they were like very blessed, fertile lands. They were resort places. They were places of, today you would travel to the islands to enjoy the white powdery sand and the clear blue seas and all the other delights that some locations have. Well, if you wanted to enjoy the physical delights of the world, especially the wines, the waters, and they had bathhouses and they had all kinds of physical, pleasurable activities there, you went to Parogaita or to Deafness. Now, Rabbi Chelbo gives an interesting teaching, which is not the way we normally understand. We know that sometime before the destruction of the first temple, so somewhere around the 6th century before the Common Era, 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel were exiled, were taken out of Israel by the Babylonians. And pretty much we've lost contact with those 10 tribes. Maybe there's been some contact historically. Maybe we've known who they are, maybe not. There's some recordings throughout history of people who have met these people who are not on the Jewish radar of Jewish communities, but suddenly have some kind of practices from the Torah. And so maybe they are long lost remnants of the 10 tribes, maybe not. There's an argument about whether these 10 tribes will eventually return or not. Towards the end of days when Mashiach will come, all the time they're finding tribes, whether it's in the Middle East or other places or South America, tribes who have customs and traditions that are very similar to ancient Jewish biblical traditions. Maybe they are descendants of the 10 tribes, maybe not. We understand normally that the reason why the 10 tribes got lost and completely detached from the Jewish community and from Israel, it was because of the exile of the Assyrian, the Babylonian emperors who exiled them. And in those times, in those days, if you didn't have technology, how would you keep in touch? How would you keep contact? And then also there was this effort by the emperors and the leaders, whenever they were trying to conquer large masses of land and countries, they would take locals and sort of spread them out all over the place. Because if you lose the stronghold of the local population, they lose their strength to be able to keep their identities and defend themselves against an enemy. But once you start to disperse them all over, then they're no longer a force or a threat to the enemy. So it's understood that they completely dispersed these 10 tribes in many different locations. But here, Reb Chelbo gives a different interpretation than we normally understand. And he says that the problem of why the issue of why these 10 tribes lost their Jewish identities was because they got too caught up with the materialistic pursuits. Once they were taken to the cities of Progaita and to the Yomset, and they just gave up on the Torah and gave up on their spiritual, religious lives and became entrenched and taken over by the physical delights of these cities. Now, that statement of Reb Chelbo is an introduction to the following story. The story goes that once Rebbe Elazar ben Arach, who's our subject for tonight, he happened to come there. He arrived at one of these cities, whether Progaita, whether the Yomset, maybe they're next to each other, and he was drawn after them. It says, I've underlined that because that's showing you here why possibly he lived there. And as a result of being drawn after them and seemingly becoming overcome by their sensual, physical attractions, his Torah learning was forgotten. The greatest of Jewish sages forgot all his Torah learning. When he returned, at some point he came back to his colleagues. It was in Yavna, in fact, because Yavna was at that time the base of one of the main yeshivot, the main schools where the Sanhedrin was, the court was, the head of the Sanhedrin, and many of his colleagues were there, as we spoke about last week. Well, when was it that he returned? So it actually fell out what would have been last week's Shabbat. The Shabbat, a few weeks before Pesach, we add an additional Torah reading to the regular Torah reading for that week. So last week's regular Torah reading was Vayakel Pekudei, the double portions, the last two portions of the book of Exodus, the book of Shemot. And then we take out a second Torah scroll and we add an additional reading from the portion of Bo in the book of Exodus. And the reading is called HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem, which starts off as an instruction of how to sanctify the moon, how to establish a Jewish calendar. God shows Moses this rebirth of the moon that's going to indicate to you the new month in the Jewish calendar, and that's how you create the calendar cycles of the Jewish festivals and the Jewish year. And then later the passage talks about the mitzvah of the Karban Pesach, the Pesach offering, to take the lamb and to inspect it and then slaughter it and sprinkle the blood on the doorposts, as they did in Egypt. So that's the connection to Pesach over here. So he came to the synagogue on such a Shabbat, and they gave him the aliyah to that final portion, which is the aliyah that we read this passage from the portion of Bo. Now, in those days, different to today. And today, when you get the aliyah, you make the blessings on the Torah, right? The beginning and the end, right? And then there's a Torah reader who reads the Torah for you. But the truth is, if you're getting the aliyah, you're supposed to read the Torah yourself. It's your aliyah. But a lot of people don't know how to read the Torah nowadays. So we have a Baal Korah who reads it for them. But it used to be, and it's still like this in some places, and if you want it to be you can do it still nowadays. When you get the aliyah, it's your aliyah, you read it. You make the blessings, you read it, and then you conclude with the blessing. So Rabbi Elazar ben Arach receives the aliyah, he makes the blessings, and he starts to read this portion. However, listen to what happened. He was supposed to read the verse that opens up this portion that says, this month shall be for you, in the Hebrew, HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem. But instead, he read something completely different. He read three different words. He read HaCheresh Haya Libam, which means, have their hearts become deaf? He was losing his mind. He forgot his Torah. He didn't even know how to read the Torah anymore. So it says the sages broke down crying, seeing that their colleague, Rebbe Elazar, the son of Arach, doesn't even know how to read Torah anymore. I mean, this is something that even a 5-year-old with a good education knows how to read. And he have the venerated sage can't even read this. So the sages prayed and asked for God to have mercy on him, and eventually his learning was restored. Just so you can understand, I wrote in the bottom of the text, I blew up those words a little bit to understand what the mistake was. If you look at the first line, there's 3 words, Chodesh Hazeh Lachem. This month shall be for you, a new moon, a new month, and the month of Nisan is the first of all the months of the year. He switched or made a mistake of one letter in each word. And the letters look very similar, so you could make a mistake if you don't know what you're doing. He switched the Dalet into a Resh, as you can see in the second line, the Zayin into a Yud in the second word, and the Chaf into a Bet. And those letters look pretty similar. The Zayin and the Yud is a bit of a stretch, but if you make a short Zayin, it could appear like a Yud. The Dal and the Resh is just one small little protruding line on the right side, and the chaf and the bet, again, the bet has also just a protruding line on the right side. So he switched those letters, and he also switched the vowels. Now, the vowels are harder to get. When you look into a Torah scroll, there are just letters without any vowels at all. So that's why the Balkor has to really prepare before Torah reading to know how to vowelize and pronounce the words correctly. So here, instead of saying HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem, he says HaCheresh Hayal Libam, complete different interpretation. Instead of this month shall be for you as a new month, he reads it, have their hearts become deaf. Now, as a result of this passage continues, and that is what we learned in the Mishnah that Rabbi Nehorai taught. Exile yourself to a place of Torah and do not say that it will follow you. Don't go to the Bahamas thinking that I can spend my days over there and still hold on to and grow in my Torah learning. Nothing against the Bahamas, and I'm sure there's a wonderful Jewish people there that you can study Torah with, but you want to gravitate towards a center of Torah study with colleagues where you can study together with them. And if you are in a place of Torah, your colleagues will establish it in your hands and do not rely on your understanding alone. Don't live alone. Make sure you're always in the company of colleagues and Torah sages. That's what Rabbi Nehorai takes away from the story. And now the Talmud adds one important piece. It was taught Rabbi Nehorai was not the real name, but rather the real name was Rabbi Nehemiah. And some say actually the real name was Rabbi Eliezer, the son of Arach. And why was it called Rabbi Nehorai? Because the word Nehorai means to illuminate. And he, this great sage, Elazar ben Arach, he illuminated the eyes of the sages in halacha and matters of Torah. He was so bright and brilliant that he taught everybody everything. So it's Rabbi Nehorai, or the same person is Rabbi Nehemiah, or the same person is Rabbi Elazar, the son of Arach, who teaches not to get lost in places away from Torah study and colleagues, but always to remain together in the center of Torah. And he's the one that teaches this because evidently he made the mistake of living a lot of his life in Progaita and Diomset away from his colleagues and the other sages. So it's an interesting story. It's a strange story. How is it? Here are some questions. How is it that a sage who has mastered the entire Torah, not just that, but a sage who has a nickname, Rabbi Nehorai, and his nickname is called that because he illuminates the eyes of the other sages. So he was among the Torah sages, he was recognized as the greatest of the great. He's the one who can expound upon the workings of a divine chariot, as we spoke about earlier. He mastered everything. How could someone like that fall so low into forgetting Torah study to the extent that he can't even read what a normal 5-year-old can read? And it wasn't like he was getting old and suffering from some kind of dementia. That can happen to anybody. That's true. No one's immune from that. But here, as we see, once the sages cried and prayed for him, his Torah study was restored. So it seems like some kind of, heavenly punishment or some kind of consequence from his actions that caused the forgetfulness. But what could happen in somebody's life that you completely forget and become so detached from everything you knew and everything you lived with? Second question. Is it just coincidental that the mistake that he made was in this passage of the Torah, the passage that talks about the new month and establishing the new moon as the new month? In other words, if he would have been called to a different aliyah, he would have also made a mistake in that one. It happened to me, he was called up to this one. Or perhaps, which we want to suggest, it wasn't coincidental at all. In fact, it was indicative of this whole episode, this whole drama, this saga that happens in his life of his decisions, which consequently led to him forgetting how to read Torah. It resulted in making mistakes in this particular Torah portion that talks about the renewal of the new month. And instead of being able to read about the renewal of the new month, he reads something else instead. What does he read? About the deafness of one's ears. It's not coincidental. Those two teachings are deeply complementing each other, and it's very significant that that's where he makes his mistake. Also, where are those mistakes? If you look at the letters again, the mistakes are all in the middle letters of the word. He didn't make a mistake in the first or the last letter of each word, but all the middle letters of each word. Why? You know that every so often you get in your WhatsApp or your emails, you get these papers of, it describes how spelling works. It's not as important as your school teachers think it is. And the way you read really is, you don't need a word to be completely correctly spelled to read that word. What you need is the first letter to be correct, the last letter to be correct, and all the middle letters can be jumbled. You've probably seen this before. And you can have a whole paragraph where every first and last letter of each word is correct, but the middle letters could all be jumbled, and yet you'll find that you'll be able to read that paragraph with a lot of ease, which tells us that the way the eyes work is it's looking for a first letter, looking for a last letter, and it's looking for the overall correct letters of the word. For example, the word table, so a T in the beginning and E at the end, but the A, B, L could be in a different order in the middle. You'd still be able to read it properly. So there's something interesting about middle letters, very different than the first and last letters. But what's the connection here to this story? Why is it happening to Rebbe Lazar son of Arach that it's the middle letter that is confusing and not the first and last letter? We need to understand this. Before we do that, let us discover a few other interesting versions of the story. The next version, which doesn't add too much, but it's got some nice description to it, is from a work called Avot de Rabbi Natan, which is a collection of the teachings of the sages during the times of the Talmud. This is in source 2. Let's read it together. When they all left, because when is this all happening? When is Rabbi Lazar, the son of Arach, leaving his colleagues and starting to live alone and then coming back? But not told too much information about where it happens. So here it says, when they all left, I don't know who's they and when was it that they left. He said, I'm going to Damyasit. So here it says clearly he didn't go to Paragaita, he went to Damyasit, which has fine waters and bathhouses, a beautiful place with good, sweet water. They said, well, we're going to Yavna. That's a place where there's an abundance of scholars who love Torah. Well, he went to Damasit. They went to Yavna to be with their Torah colleagues. Damasit was a beautiful place with good, sweet water, and his reputation for Torah study diminished. And they went to Yavna, the place where there was an abundance of scholars who all loved the Torah, and their reputation in Torah study grew. So this is a clear source that tells you it was really a choice. It was a choice of following the Torah sages, going to Yavna, clearly, which was the bastion, the hub of Torah study. There you could grow, there you could feed off your colleagues, there you could continue your studies and advance, or to move to one of the islands far away from any Torah scholars, Torah center, and choose the good, sweet waters and the luxurious life instead, which is the choice that he made. I guess that's another big question we need to understand is, how does the great sage of Elazar ben Arach make such a choice? This is a person who loved Torah, who was immersed in Torah. In fact, he taught earlier, we learned in the Mishnah, you have to always be diligent and immersed in Torah every single spare second of your time. And yet here he makes the choice not to go to Yavne, but to go to the island, the luxurious resort instead. Third source. The third source on the other side of the page is from the Medrash on the book of Kohelet, the scroll of Ecclesiastes by King Solomon. Here, there's a number of additions that flesh out the story even further. So listen to this. Rabbi Yochanan had 5 disciples. Now, Rabbi Yochanan had many more than 5 disciples. He had thousands of disciples. But this is actually a teaching that you're going to see in the next source. Also, we're going to get to that. He had 5 primary disciples, or 5 disciples that he really thought maybe would be his future. They'd be his successors after he passes away. And they lived together with him and studied with him all the time. When he died, this is the background here. Rabbi Yochanan dies, and now these 5 students, when a great teacher, a great master dies, what's going to happen now? What are the students going to do? How are they going to carry on the tradition? How are they going to rebuild their lives? How are they going to move on from this? So it says that they all decided to move to Yavne. Yavne was the place they're going to stay there, congregate there, and be able to continue the legacy of their teacher and continue those teachings. Rabbi Elazar, the son of Arach, left his friends and he joined his wife. I've underlined this because this is an addition. Does it mean his wife was always living there and he was away from his wife in Yavne? Does it mean his wife was with him in Yavne, but she wanted to go? Blame it on the wife. She wants to go, so I'll go. It's an addition. and it's a place of good water and beautiful scenery. Now, he waited for them to come, but they did not. Meaning, interesting. When he goes there, he says, I'm the greatest student, right? So probably, I assume, even though they've decided now to go to Yavne, but once I'm not there anymore, it's no fun without me. So they're probably going to all come, gravitate, follow me, and we'll build the community here in Diyomset and the beautiful scenery near the beautiful water and bathhouses. But they didn't. He's waiting and waiting, and nobody comes. When they didn't come, he says to his wife, you know what? This is not working out as we planned. Let's go back. We need to be together with them. But his wife does not let him. And she tells him, who needs who? She asked. He said, well, they need me. So she says to him, in the case of a food container and mice, or actually more literal in the Hebrew, in the case of bread and mice, does the food go to the mice or do the mice go to the food? Bread doesn't go to the mouse. The mouse goes to the bread. And now what she's telling him, you are the bread. You are the food. You are the nourishing source of Torah. And somehow she compares them to the mice, which is maybe not such a, she was trying to be a little derogatory over there. And she's saying, they need to come to you. You don't go to them. Well, he listened to her like a good husband and remained there until he forgot his learning. So that's what happened. He wanted to go back, but she said, don't go back. And he waits for them to come, but they never come, and therefore he forgets his learning. After a while, they came and asked him a halachic question. They had a question that came up in Yavna. They didn't know the answer. They said, we may as well go ask Rebbe Lazar. We have a chance to go visit him. I'm sure he knows the answer. And they asked him a question about, it's not relevant what the question is, which is better to eat along with relish, wheat bread or barley bread. It's a halachic question about a particular meal. But he couldn't answer because he forgot everything. So here's an example that's brought down here in this Midrashic teaching about the law that he forgot, which was a law that he was expected to know, and the students or the colleagues assumed he's going to know it, but he did not know it. So that's the version with a lot more description in source number 3. Now we have to get to our questions. We're trying to understand how this all happened to the greatest of sages. How does he forget it? Why does he decide to move there to the Yomset, away from the colleagues, away from, imagine a Rosh Yeshiva, a Rebbe, a great teacher, and one day he says, I'm moving to the Bahamas, I'm moving to an island, and there's no community there, there's no synagogue over there, there's no yeshiva there, there's no libraries over there. It doesn't make any sense. And as a consequence, Rebbe Lazar forgets all his learning. And why does he make the mistake in the synagogue about this particular verse of Chodesh Zelachem, which is the renewal of the new moon, and his mistake is about the deaf hearts of himself or of the people? So I want to share with you a number of answers. The first answer, which is the obvious one, which most of the commentaries right away pick up on, is the potential destructive force of this endless pursuit of materialism. Now, when you're trying to succeed and grow and develop in a spiritual life, it's one or the other. You either put yourself in a space, in a place where you develop and grow spiritually, and that's at the expense of a lot of material delight and pleasure, because one conflicts with the other. Materialism is when a person is pursuing pleasure, physical, sensational, sensual pleasure, the good wines, the good waters, good food, good scenery. The spiritual life is very different. A person is trying to nurture their mind, nurture their heart, attain wisdom, achieve altruism in their hearts, become a bigger mensch, work on your character, midot tavot, know how to be kind and generous and forgiving, and master your emotions, not to get angry, not to be impatient, to be welcoming, to be loving. That's when someone's working on their character. And either you're working on your character and you're working on yourself, or you're busy pleasuring yourself and trying to just feed yourself more and more with material delights. It's one or the other. You really can't have both. In fact, there's a teaching in the Zohar. The Zohar, the great mystical work, says as follows. It's a very strong teaching. It says, Tukfa de gufa chulshat v'nishmasa. It means the strengthening of the body brings a weakening to the soul, and vice versa. The strengthening of the soul brings a weakening to the body. Soul and body is metaphor for the physical pursuits, materialism, or spiritual advancement and development. You're either strengthening one or the other, and whichever one you're strengthening, you're weakening the other. We believe in the pursuit of happiness. Happiness is an important trait. Happiness and pleasure is often confused by many people because it could be which one leads to the other. For many people, they make the mistake that the pleasure leads to happiness. You want to pursue pleasure. You want the good material life, whether it's the money and the ships and the trips and the clothing and the food and the scenery and who knows what, assuming that will bring you happiness. It probably does bring you some happiness, but it's very superficial happiness. It's very transient happiness. It's happiness which is not very real. It's more momentary. And it's sort of happiness was just covering over a lot of other stuff in your life which you're not willing to work through, and you're covering it over with the superficiality of those materialistic pleasures. It should be the other way around. It should be the pursuit of genuine happiness. And the genuine happiness should bring you pleasure. So the genuine happiness is achieved when you are looking to live nobly and live happily and be a loving, kind, forgiving person, building relationships with others, pursuing wisdom of the mind and developing one's heart in a very emotionally expressive way to others, to God, to the Torah. And when you work on this trait of happiness, that will lead to pleasure. It will be the pleasure of having advanced your life in ways that you fulfill your potential in truly meaningful ways. That is a far deeper pleasure. So this was the mistake of Rabbi Elazar, the son of Arach. He made a choice, and his choice was, instead of going to Yavna and to live together with his colleagues, and Yavna was not as beautiful of a city, and the homes weren't so nice, and the living conditions were not so glorious, but there you had the Torah, and there you had real colleagues, and there you had people that truly cared about you, that truly loved you, and there you could build community, and there you could really advance yourself and for the benefit of your family. But it chose to live in that physically luxurious place, but that choice came with consequences. And so living in that indulgent material life truly caused a diminishing, a weakening of his spiritual self, to the point that he actually forgot his Torah. It's not on the forefront of your mind anymore. It's not a priority anymore. And if you don't exercise the muscles of the mind, the muscles of the heart, the muscles of the soul, then you get weak. And you find this when you have stages where you're so immersed in the indulgence of physical material pleasure, you are becoming more and more detached from the life of the spirit. And you'll find yourself possibly becoming more egotistic, more focused on pleasuring yourself, and losing the traits of selflessness and humility and the sense of valuing another person and putting their needs ahead of yours. Which is why the mistake that he makes in the Torah, which he forgot, was the portion talking about the sanctifying of the new month and the idea of time. The calendar revolves around time. And when we talk about Kiddush HaChodesh, the sanctifying of the new moon, where the mitzvah, the command, is really to sanctify time. Time is precious. We only get a very limited amount of time in our lives. And this constant effort of creating the Jewish calendar and understanding the months, and we talk about this and we focus on it every single day, and the months pass by and we have our celebrations, it all is to condition us in ways that we should value time more. But here is his mistake. He goes to waste away his life in the luxurious resorts, and he loses the value of time. And days and months and years goes by, and he's not treasuring every moment to study more, to grow more, to live deeper. And so therefore, the mistake that he makes, he says, I've become deaf. My heart has become deaf. Deaf to what? Deaf to the value of time. So I no longer read about this is the way you establish a new month, a new moon. I've forgotten about that. I've become numb and deaf and apathetic to the beauty, the value, the treasure of the limited amount of time we have in this world. That is an important teaching. Something we can always evaluate our lives with. We only have a limited amount of time. How much are we immersed and engaged and focused on the pursuit of material pleasure? Some of it is important, some of it is good, but not at the expense of the true hard work and the true ultimate pleasurable work of personal development, of spiritual life, of wisdom, of learning, of studying, of growing, of emotional attachment in relationships and building community. That is the ultimate where we should be applying our focus and our attention in life. That's teaching number one. Teaching number two, the value and the importance of friendship. If you ever say to yourself, I have good friends, I enjoy their company, but I am able to live on my own. I could go away to an island. I could be in a place where I don't know anybody, and I'll live a good, comfortable life. I mean, no one will disturb me. No one will know me. I could be whatever I want, do whatever I want, and I succeed in my life in that way. That is a mistake. It is impossible. A human being, by definition, is like a social animal. We thrive, we grow when we're in the presence of others, when we're connecting with other people. Our lives have to be intertwined with other people. That's the nature of the human being. That's the nature of the spiritual life also. Other religions, other spiritual doctrines talk about experiencing spiritual experiences when you're alone. Go alone to a mountaintop, alone to a remote place, and there you meditate, and there you levitate, and there you... Judaism never had that. We have practices of solitude and of solitary experiences, but in general, the mitzvot, the spiritual experiences, are experienced in a communal way. We have synagogues, we have festivals, we have times when people come together as community, we pray together, we sing together, we study together. That's the way that we truly experience something spiritual. That's the way we can truly grow, because we are feeding off each other, teaching each other, and learning from each other, challenging each other, and therefore growing together with each other. In fact, the mission teaches us that if you want to truly succeed in Torah study, you have to have what's called dibuk chaverim. You have to have this attachment, this communication, this conversation with others. You have to be able to share the idea. They have to be able to challenge you. You challenge them back, and the two of you come together and you grow from it. On your own, you cannot succeed in a spiritual life. It's a mistake many people make. Rabbi Lazar, at that moment, thought, all my colleagues are going to Yavne. They're going to enjoy each other's company. I'm able to make it alone. I'm going to go live the quiet life, the peaceful life in Dimyoset. And there I'll be able to go on my spiritual journey. But when he gets there, he realizes actually being in so alone is a detriment, is harmful to your spiritual journey, to the point that eventually he forgets all of these Torah learning. Here is something interesting. Look back at your source sheet. Look back at those three letters that he made a mistake. He read it, Hacheresh Hayal Libam. What are those three letters that I've underlined where he made the mistake? It's a Resh, a Yud, and a Bet. They spell the word Riv. Riv means friction, tension, quarreling, disagreeing. A person who removes himself away from others is often creating a kind of quarrel. Why can't you be among us? Why can't you join us? Be part of the group, study with us, pray with us, schmooze with us, eat with us. Why are you alone? And when you're being alone and refusing to be a part of us, creates a riv, creates a tension. Tension, arguments, quarreling, disagreements in that kind of way is, as the spiritual mystics explain, the source of all evil. Somebody who's argumentative, somebody who's what we call a bal machloket. Some people, they love to create chaos. They love to create friction and arguments and questions and challenges, opposing others. Anyone who lives in that kind of way, it's a terrible, terrible klipa, a spiritual kind of defilement, a spiritual trait where you create such a void, such a spiritual emptiness in the world. The nation of Midian, which you're probably familiar with from the Torah, Midian was coming to attack the Jewish people. But the way the spiritual mystics describe Midian stood for the value, or what they considered a value, of creating machloket, of creating division among people, quarreling among people. And God tells Moses, before you pass away, you first have to eradicate, conquer, defeat the war against Midian. On a simple level, it was protecting the Jewish people from the Midian nation. But on a spiritual level, God tells Moses, in order for the Jewish people to be able to enter into Israel and build a sovereign nation, a cohesive, unified nation together, you have to eradicate this klippah. You have to eradicate this force among humans where there's this need to oppose and to challenge and to argue and to quarrel. That trait can eat away, can rot away the fabric of relationships, the fabric of community. It's a terrible, divisive thing. Rabbi Eliezer moving away created riv, created tension and quarreling and division, divisiveness among him and his colleagues. And so the mistake that he makes in the Torah are those three letters of Resh, Yud, and Bet, which is riv. Let me give you another explanation. Along the lines of these three letters, we mentioned earlier that which letters did Rebbe Elazar ben Azariah make a mistake in? The middle letters of the words. Not the first, not the last, but the middle letters. Why? Why did it happen to be the middle letters? It could have been the first and the last. So there's a commentary that learns something very powerful from this. There are three stages to everything and to life: a beginning, a middle, and an end. Any project, there's the beginning. We start, we launch it, we get it off the ground. There's the end. The end is seeing the final product. But then there's the middle. The middle is the hard work. The middle is you're no longer in the stage of the excitement of the launching of the product. You're not at the end. You're not seeing the final results. You're just doing the hard work in the middle. That middle stage, though, is one of the most important stages because it's what links the beginning to the end. It's what actually allows a beginning to result in an end. But many people have a big challenge with the middle stage. You have a lot of people that are very good at starting projects, launching things off the ground. It's very exciting. You have a lot of people who are always there at the end to see things through, to see the results. But who's there in the middle? Who's able to do the hard work to get this thing towards its end? The same story on a larger level, on the more spiritual levels with life. In life, there are always three questions. The mission tells us always ask yourself three questions. Question number one, where did you come from? Question number two, where are you now? Question number three, and where are you heading to? So question number one, everyone knows, where did I come from? I was created by God. I came from my parents. I value, I treasure, I'm grateful for God bringing me into this world, giving me my mission. I recognize that I'm important. Where are you heading to? I also know about that. I'm good with that. I know that there's a glorious end purpose to my life. I know that there'll be an end of days. I know that I'll get there in the way that God wants me to get there. But what about now? What about the middle stage? What about your actual life you're living now? Very often you'll see that some of the people's, the way they're conducting themselves now in the middle stage of their life is not advancing and is not connecting their altruistic beginnings and ends. That's the hard work. There's a very famous poem called The Dash. The Dash is a poem that I often read actually at funerals because it's a good reflection. And the theme of the poem is, if you look at anyone and everyone's tombstone, there's always the same thing on a tombstone. There's a date, then a dash, and then another date. The date you were born, the dash, and the date that you passed away. And the poem says, the date at the beginning you had no control over. You were born. The date at the end, hopefully you had no control over either. Your life was taken from you. The dash in the middle, that's your life story. That's where you had control. Those were your decisions. Those were your choices. That was the journey that you took upon yourself. And so the question to reflect on always in life is the dash. Right now you're living in your dash. You were born. You're going to die. But what's in between? How are you spending that time? How are you spending your life? So this is the idea of Rabbi Eliezer making a mistake with the three middle letters, because it's those middle letters, the middle stages of the project, the middle parts of your life, the part in between that fuses together beginning and end, and they can bring actual success between beginning and end. That's the biggest challenge of many people. That's where suddenly our hearts can go numb. That's when we lose sight sometimes and we get caught up. We forget. We become lazy. We just want to choose the easier path, the more convenient path. We forget about the important hard work that's required to bring the beginning to the fruition at the end. It's a very important reflection, and that's the mistake that Rabbi Elazar made in those three middle letters. I want to share with you two more answers, hopefully, if we have time. We'll do one more answer for now because we're running a little late. I really wanted to share with you the next one, but we're going to skip that and I'll give you the final answer. Before I read the final answer, I want you to go back to your source sheet because we have two more sources to study together. Look at source number 4 and source number 5. Okay. Source number 4 is a comment that we read earlier. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had 5 students. Who were they? Again, we said the 5 primary students. Rabbi Eliezer, the son of Horkanus, Rabbi Yeshua, the son of Hananiah, Rabbi Yossi, who was a priest, Rabbi Shimon, the son of Netanel, and Rabbi Elazar ben Arach, that 5th one being our subject for tonight. Now then the Mishnah records that he would recount their praises, but each one of these 5 students, he had a particular praise, something they excelled in. And I'm quoting you the first and the last. Rabbi Elazar, the son of Horkanus, what was his praise? He's a pit covered in plaster that does not lose a drop. You dig a hole in the ground, if it's just earth and you pour water in, the water will seep through and it'll empty out from the hole. But if you plaster that hole with cement, the water won't seep through, it will stay there. Rabbi Eliezer, the son of Horkanus, his mind was like a plastered pit, meaning any piece of information, any Torah that entered his mind, he never forgot it. He retained all the wisdom, all the knowledge that he learned from his teachers. That was his praise. What's the praise of Rabbi Eliezer, son of Arach? He's an ever-strengthening fountain. Very different kind of praise. This is not just the idea of you retain everything that you're given or that you're taught, but this is the fountain. The fountain has this kind of internal, innate engine that generates its own water, generates its own energy, and it's always not just retaining water, but it's always overflowing with water. Rabbi Eliezer son of Arach had this unique ability, this creative talent, this energetic ability to always be producing and always be creating more and more. You taught him something, he wouldn't just remember it and retain it, but he would actually learn from it and expand upon it and use it to stimulate additional thoughts, additional teachings. He was always growing. And now the question is, which one is greater? What's a greater trait? The trait to be able to be the one that absorbs and remembers everything, and therefore all the teachings of the sages of your Rebbe, you're a perfect source, a perfect product of the teachings of your Rebbe, or you have an individualistic trait to yourself. You have your own creative abilities to use your powers, your wisdom, your creative talents to achieve more, to grow more, to expound, to discover more. More of you is being expressed over here, but you're creating more as well. So in the first version of the Mishnah says that he used to say, if all the sages of Israel were on the side of a balanced scale, and they were all on one side, and Rabbi Eliezer, the son of Horkanus, was on the other side, he would outweigh them all. In other words, in this first version, Rabbi Yochanan says, actually, Rabbi Eliezer, the son of Horkanus, with the trait of being that plastered cistern, that's the greatest value. Be true to the Torah, true to the teachings of the sages. Something you were taught, it was given off to you, and as it is, without any kind of change, without any kind of filter, you have the word of the Torah and the word of the sages inside your system, never forgetting a thing. Then Abba Shaul says in the name of the sages, actually a different version, meaning that if all the sages, including Rabbi Eliezer, the son of Horkanus, were on one side of the scale, and on the other side was Rabbi Eliezer, the son of Arach, which is our subject, he would outweigh them all. Meaning, actually, the power of being an ever-strengthening fountain is far greater than being the plastered system, the plastered pit. Which one is greater? To hold on to the old, or to move away from that and grow something new. Think about in terms of spiritual life, in terms of Jewish tradition and continuity. Think about communities or teachings that espouse on holding on to old world values, the way it was always done, the way we taught things, the way we understood things, the way we lived our lives. Let's treasure that. That's what our forefathers did. That's what our Babas and Zetas did. Let's continue doing that. Or the other way that says, that's for the old world. That's for them, but not for us. We're in a new world, a modern world, different technologies. It's a new, all new agendas, a new horizon today. Let's grow from that. Let's change things. Let's do things differently that are more suitable for our age. Which one is more important? Which one is a greater instrument for success at Jewish continuity, at preserving Jewish identity, at strengthening the study and the passing on of Torah from generation to generation? Which one works? And in fact, that's always been a debate and a dispute among the generations. And in the past few centuries, we've had the ultra-conservatives who have been very fixated on holding on to the old and not leaving from that, whether it's customs or the way they dress or the things they wear or the things they do. Or you have the ultra-progressives who said, we have to change from this. We have to become something different. It's a new world today. Thank you, Gary, for that comment. I'll put that up here. So he says, the lesson of a dash is for each one of us to pause and think long and hard now about what we would want to be said at our funerals and how do we spend our gift of a dash. Very good. Yeah. Or do it even without thinking about what they're going to say about us at the funerals, because then we do it because we really believe in it. It's even greater, right? So we have these two models, and we have two opinions about which one is greater. Then we have another teaching. Mishnah number 9, source 5. Rabbi Yochanan gave a challenge to his students, and he said, go out and see what is the best path, what's a straight path for a person in life. Rabbi Eliezer, the son of Hyrcanus, said, a positive eye. Rabbi Elazar, the son of Arach, said, a good heart. Rabbi Yochanan responds, I see the words of Rabbi Elazar, the son of Arach, greater than all of yours because your words are included in his. So he says a good eye, he says a good heart, and Rabbi Yochanan says good heart. A good heart is the most important trait. Everything is included in a good heart. Then he says, go and see what is an evil path that a person should distance himself from. What should you stay away from? What's a negative character trait that can completely destroy you and destroy others? Rabbi Eliezer, the son of Hyrcanus, said the opposite. He said a negative eye. When you cast a negative eye and you look at things in a negative way and you're always judgmental and you're always cynical and you're always critical, that's the worst thing. Rabbi Eliezer says something is worse, a bad heart. To be able to not be able to feel for somebody, empathize with somebody, appreciate somebody in your heart, that's the worst. Rabbi Yochanan says, I see the words of Elazar ben Arach, the bad heart, as the greatest. He's the most correct because your words are included in his. The bad heart is worse than anything else. How interesting. Rabbi Elazar ben Arach is the one that says, and he recognizes that the good heart, the positive heart, is the most important trait in life. In other words, to have a heart that is open and receptive and feeling and experiencing and communicating and sharing with others. And the most negative trait in life is to have a bad heart, a heart that is closed, a heart that cannot feel, that cannot empathize, a heart that is numb to another person's pain. And here he comes to the synagogue, and he's supposed to be reading the verse about HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem, sanctifying the new moon, creating a new month. And instead he makes the mistake. And he talks about the deaf, numb heart. He of all people. What's going on over here? Why is that? So the teaching goes like this. I'll just share this briefly. This is something that the Lubavitcher Rebbe taught. We have like two conflicting views in the Talmud about how to approach materialism in life. On the one hand, there's a Mishnah that teaches You should minimize in any kind of material pleasure and delight in the world. If you want to succeed in Torah study, if you want to succeed in learning, you have to get away with bare minimums. Eat bread and water, literally. That is one teaching. There's another teaching the Talmud says is the exact opposite and says, Chamra v'reicha pikhin, enjoying precious wine and fragrant smells make you wiser. And one of the sages said that one day I was studying and I wasn't able to focus and understand properly. And then I ate a delicious steak and a nice piece of meat and I enjoyed a good dinner. And then I was able to study with an open heart and open mind after. Which one is it? To live a simple life or to live a more complex, sophisticated life? Which one is healthier for a spiritual life? So the answer is as follows. This is a very deep idea. The simple life, the life to simply succeed and to get it right all the time, is to live like Rabbi Elazar, the son of Horkanes. What was his trait? Bor suj eno ma'abed tipa. He was that cistern, that cemented pit that never lost a drop. Follow the words of the sages. Listen to the rabbis. Study the Torah. Whatever it says, accept it. It's true. No questioning, no challenging, no creative genius in developing. Just take it at face value. That's a safe life. And it's expressed in the way you physically conduct yourself. Conduct yourself also in a very simple way. Don't challenge your senses with all kinds of delicious foods and aromas and physical material experiences because they can get you carried away. Live a very conservative life. And if you live a conservative life and you approach the Torah in a conservative way, you're safe. In fact, the Rebbe explains, that was the way to live in good times, in times of light, in the times when the temple stood, when the temple was around, and you could go to the temple, you could go to Jerusalem, you could see God. There was the Sanhedrin, there was a court, there was, at one point, there was prophecy, there was communication between God and the people, there was connection. It was a simpler life. Things were more apparent, things were more obvious. Ayin Tova, says Rebbe Elazar, the greatest trait is the good eye. See things. See the right things. Look at the right things. Don't look at the wrong things. However, after the temple was destroyed, after there's no longer this revelation of godliness in Jerusalem, when the world became a lot darker, there's no longer a communication between God and the people. Now we're living in the state of exile, not just a physical exile, the political exile, but also a spiritual exile. We're living in a state of darkness. Ayin, the eye, we don't see anymore. You can't go to Jerusalem and see God, see the miracles. We don't see anymore. How do you find the truth? How do you connect with the Torah? How do you succeed in your spiritual life if you cannot see the truths anymore? Eliezer says, now it's all in the heart. Now you have to have a very clever, intuitive heart. Now your heart has to be very sensitive and very wise to be able to be open and receptive to the good things, to the right things, and not to be dulled. The senses should not be dulled by all kinds of foreign influences and forces. Now's the time that we adopt the model of Rabbi Eliezer, the son of Arach. What was his model? His model of learning, his model of life was to be the never-ending, growing fountain. Now's the time to dig deep and to be creative. Because if you're looking for a clear direction from God, you can't go to the temple, ask the high priest to get a prophecy, and God will tell you. You can't do that anymore. So then you got to look inside your heart. You got to look deep into in an honest way, deep into your own consciousness. And hopefully you're speaking to the real you. You're not speaking to a superficial you, or you that is skewed, you that's distorted by all kinds of foreign influences. And it's in that place that you have a real honest conversation with yourself about your connection with God and with the Torah in your heart. And to achieve that, sometimes the more sophisticated life as the Talmud says, the good wine, the good meat, you stimulate your senses. When you stimulate your senses, you allow yourself not just to live a more ultra-conservative, simple life, but you allow yourself to be in a heightened state. And in that heightened state, you have the ability to grow and to be creative and to develop and to be ambitious and to explore new ideas and always to go deeper and go further, always to challenge yourself and become more and more and more, which is so important during a time of darkness. Look, by the way, when was there this rush, this unbelievable growth of the rabbinic tradition of Torah, of the rabbis coming together and developing and advancing Torah? It all happened, almost all happened, after the temple was destroyed. All of our Talmudic teachings and our profound conversations among the rabbis of developing Torah and the Torah law and the arguments and the agreements and the reconciliations, it all happened after the temple was destroyed. During temple times, life was more simple. Life was more obvious. There weren't many disagreements. There wasn't a need to have that kind of creative effort. We have very little rabbinic tradition from before the temple was destroyed. During the time of darkness, it could be a time of the greatest creativity. Which is why Rabbi Elazar says, I'm not going to move to Yavne, where all my colleagues are, and live with them and study with them. You know why? They're good people. And it's a wonderful community. However, I feel like if I go there, I'm just going to get stuck in the mold. I'm just going to be more of the same, more like everybody else. And I actually had a disagreement with those rabbis. Those rabbis were more conservative in their approach. They were not willing to bring novelty and creativity to Torah. And so he said, I don't agree with that model. I think now is a time to be ambitious, to be daring, to be creative in our studies, to develop more and to create more and to discover more so that we bring the darkness to life. We find in the state of darkness, we find the opportunity of growth. In Yavne with my colleagues, I'm never going to be able to do that. I'm going alone to Dim Yoset. It's a place of material pleasure. There I'll be able to stimulate my senses with the good wine, the good water, the good bathhouses, the good scenery. And it's there that I'm going to be able to experience being who I am, this never-ending, growing and flowing fountainhead. That's why he moved there. However, you need to know one thing. Choosing that life is a riskier life. You can achieve much more. You can grow much more. You can succeed much more. However, you're also endangering yourself. Because the more you expose yourself to those material pleasures, if you don't do it in the right balance, and you lose your altruism, and you lose the goal, you can actually become overcome by them. They take you over and they detach you away from your spiritual life. It's a very risky place to be if you don't do it right. That's the power of the heart. The heart is the most important organ. The Talmud tells us, the Kabbalah, the Zohar tells us, you know what God wants? God wants your heart. He doesn't want your mind so much. Of course, you have to study Torah, you have to know Torah. But more important than knowing and studying Torah is feeling it, is what kind of relationship and connection are you creating with God and with Torah and with other people? Is it just a subject of your mind? Or is it something that you've turned into a lifestyle? Many people enjoy the study of Torah. But how many people have turned that into something that their heart appreciates, the heart yearns for? It's become their lifestyle, their love and their passion. But this heart, it succeeds when it's like a middle organ. It receives from the mind. The mind controls everything, including the heart. So the heart receives its instructions, its life vitality from the mind, and from there it's able to pump blood to the rest of the system. You want to be a successful fountainhead, like Reb Elazar son of Arach, you have to have the humility to remember that you're here to serve God. You're here to study and live by the Torah. You're here to accept the truths of the Torah. And once you have that humility to accept that, you take that as your foundation and you run with that. And you use it, and you use your creative abilities to grow on top of that. But the moment you forget about, you lose that humility. Because you've been overtaken by these physical, sensual experiences and pleasures. And then your heart has become dulled. And if your heart becomes dulled, then you lose your way. And Reb Elazar son of Arach, the Talmud tells us, That was what he tried to do going to Dim Yosef, but he ended up losing his way. And he ended up forgetting the Torah. And when he came back and he made this mistake about talking about the deafness of the heart, which was really like describing himself, really, what was the verse talking about? The renewal of the month. The renewal of the month and the establishing of the Jewish calendar, which was given to the hands of the Jewish people, not to God. God tells us we need to establish when is Shabbat, when is a festival, when is a new month. The power of the human ingenuity and the human creativity to establish law, to establish spiritual realities. That personified the efforts of Rabbi Elazar ben Arach. That's what he stood for. He was this never-ending growing fountainhead. But he lost his way. And instead of reading about the abilities of renewal, he instead dulled his heart and he forgot how to read it. So what's the lesson? Let's conclude. A challenge for us to have the leiv tov, to have a good heart, and not a leiv ra, not a pessimistic heart, not a apathetic heart, not a dulled heart. Coming up to Pesach. Pesach, we want to experience renewal. Pesach, we want to experience a discovery of redemption. What are those things in life that are holding you down, that are imprisoning you, that are exiling you, that are not allowing you to be really you? That there's a fear, or what someone is going to say about me, or I don't have that courage to take that step, to throw myself in, to truly immerse myself in the Torah, truly immerse myself in connection with Hashem, in a prayer, take a moment to be real and honest about it. So you have to have that courage. You want to have that open, sensitive, feeling, intuitive, sympathetic, empathetic heart. That's what we want to experience on Pesach. To learn from Rabbi Elazar ben Arach, to keep the heart alive, and to make sure that when it comes to Pesach, we're able to read the verse, HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem. This month should be a month of renewal. It should be a time where we have our wits about us and we keep our heart engaged in feeling for others, in connecting with the Torah, in allowing a sense of honesty and passion in our lives for the real things. For example, leading up to Pesach, how much do you care about, how much are you paying attention to how others are celebrating Pesach? Others need assistance, others need help. Maybe you're contributing to a fund, don't just focus on your own Pesach. Yes, your Pesach should be beautiful. You should go and buy whatever you need and make sure your home and your Seder is beautiful. But how about someone else's also? The experience of helping someone else, the experience of celebrating the festival with somebody else can be the greatest of spiritual experiences. Friendship, never being alone, away from your friends. Always remembering, as we learned together, the possible distraction of the pursuit of materialism. Remembering the middle letters, the dash in your life, and remembering that the key to success is the open heart. So my friends, I want to wish you a Chag Kasher v'Sameach. Hopefully we're going to learn next week also, so we'll have more chance to focus on the festival of Pesach. But for now, I want to wish you a good night. Thank you for joining us, and God bless you.